The dust from the horse's hooves had barely settled when Sarah Palmer collapsed against the wooden counter of the general store in Fort Stanton, New Mexico Territory, her pale face gleaming with sweat that had nothing to do with the August heat of 1878. Frank Emerson had just walked through the door, spurs jangling softly against the worn floorboards, when he saw her knees buckle. He moved faster than he'd ever moved in his 26 years, catching her before her head could crack against the counter's edge. Her body burned like a furnace in his arms, and her eyes rolled back as consciousness fled completely. "Someone get the doctor," Frank shouted, but the storekeeper, old Mr. Henderson, shook his head grimly. "Doc's gone to Socorro. Won't be back for 3 days at least. There's been an outbreak of something down there." Frank looked down at the woman in his arms. She couldn't have been more than 22 or 23, with dark hair that had come loose from its pins and now hung in damp strands across her flushed cheeks. Her dress, though simple, was clean and well mended, suggesting she took pride in her appearance despite modest means. But what struck him most was how delicate she seemed, how vulnerable, and something deep in his chest tightened with an unfamiliar protectiveness. "Where does she live?" Frank asked, adjusting his hold on her slight frame. "That's Sarah Palmer," Henderson said, wringing his hands. "She's been teaching at the schoolhouse since spring. Lives in the boarding house, but Mrs. Crawford's got her hands full with 6 other boarders and 2 sick children of her own. I don't think she could take on another invalid right now." Frank made a decision that would change his life forever. "I'll take her to my place." Henderson's eyebrows shot up. "Your place? Frank, that wouldn't be proper. You're an unmarried man." "I've got a spare room since my brother moved to California last year. And unless you've got a better suggestion, proper doesn't matter much when someone's dying of fever." Frank's voice was hard, brooking no argument. He'd spent 8 years working cattle drives and dealing with outlaws and rattlesnakes. He could handle nursing one sick woman. The storekeeper hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I'll let Mrs. Crawford know, and I'll send word when the doctor returns." Frank carried Sarah out into the blazing afternoon sun. His horse, a sturdy bay named Rusty, stood waiting at the hitching post. Getting into the saddle while holding an unconscious woman wasn't easy, but Frank managed, settling Sarah across his lap. She made a small sound, something between a whimper and a moan, and her head lolled against his shoulder. His homestead was only 2 miles outside of town, a modest adobe house with a small barn and a corral. It wasn't much, but it was his, bought with money he'd saved from years of hard work. He'd been planning to expand it, maybe find a wife and start a family, but those had been vague future dreams. Now, with this woman's fevered body pressed against him, the future suddenly felt much more immediate. The ride felt endless. Sarah's breathing was shallow and rapid, and twice she cried out incomprehensible words, lost in whatever fever dreams plagued her. Frank found himself murmuring reassurances, though he doubted she could hear him. When they finally reached his house, Frank dismounted carefully and carried Sarah inside. The spare bedroom was sparse, furnished only with a bed, a chair, and a small table. He laid her down gently on the quilt his mother had made years ago before she'd passed. Sarah's eyes fluttered briefly, and for a moment he thought she might wake, but then she was still again, save for the rapid rise and fall of her chest. Frank had seen fever before, had even survived a bout himself when he was 16. He knew what needed to be done. He filled a basin with cool water from the pump outside, found clean cloths, and returned to the bedside. Carefully, respectfully, he loosened the high collar of her dress to help her breathe easier, then began bathing her face and neck with the cool water. Her skin was so hot it felt unnatural. Frank's jaw tightened with worry. He'd told Henderson he could handle this, but now, alone with this dying woman, doubt crept in. What if he couldn't save her? What if she woke up terrified to find herself in a stranger's home? What if she never woke up at all? He pushed those thoughts aside and focused on the task at hand. Throughout that long afternoon and into the evening, Frank stayed by Sarah's side, changing the water when it grew warm, bathing her face and arms, trying to bring down the fever that raged through her. He forced water between her lips whenever she seemed even slightly conscious, knowing she needed to drink. As darkness fell, Frank lit a lamp and continued his vigil. He should have been exhausted after a long day of working his small herd, but adrenaline and something else, something he couldn't quite name, kept him alert. He found himself studying her face in the lamplight. Even in the grip of illness, she was beautiful. Not in a flashy way, but with a quiet loveliness that spoke of inner strength and kindness. Around midnight, Sarah's fever spiked higher. She began to thrash, crying out words Frank could barely make out. Something about children, about school, about someone named Margaret. He held her shoulders gently, trying to keep her from hurting herself, murmuring soothing words. "You're safe," he told her over and over. "You're safe, Sarah, I've got you." Whether she heard him or not, he couldn't say, but eventually the thrashing subsided and she fell into a restless sleep. Frank sagged in his chair, realizing his shirt was soaked with sweat. He should change, should eat something, but he couldn't bring himself to leave her side for more than a moment. The night stretched on endlessly. Frank dozed occasionally, but always woke with a start, immediately checking to make sure Sarah was still breathing. Each time he found her alive, relief flooded through him. He barely knew this woman, yet the thought of losing her filled him with a dread he couldn't explain. Dawn broke slowly, painting the sky outside the window in shades of pink and gold. Frank stood stiffly, stretching muscles that had cramped from sitting so long. Sarah's breathing seemed a bit easier, though her face was still flushed with fever. He bathed her face again, then went to care for his animals and prepare some broth. If when she woke, she'd need nourishment. He just returned to the bedroom with a cup of broth when Sarah's eyes opened. They were brown, he noted with surprise, a deep warm brown that reminded him of autumn leaves. For a moment they were unfocused, confused, but then they fixed on him. "Where am I?" Her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse and weak. Frank set the broth down and pulled his chair closer. "My name is Frank Emerson. You collapsed at the general store yesterday. You've got a bad fever. The doctor's out of town, so I brought you here to care for you." Sarah's eyes widened with alarm and she tried to sit up, but the effort was too much. She fell back against the pillows, gasping. "This is not proper. I should not be here." "Proper went out the window when you were dying," Frank said bluntly. "Mrs. Crawford couldn't take you and there was no one else. You needed help and I could give it. That's all that matters." Tears gathered in Sarah's eyes. "I do not even know you." "No," Frank agreed, "but I couldn't let you die in a boarding house with no one to care for you. Now you need to drink something. Can you manage some broth?" Sarah looked like she wanted to argue, but she was too weak. She nodded slightly. Frank helped her sit up enough to drink, supporting her with one arm while holding the cup with his other hand. She managed only a few sips before exhaustion claimed her again, and she slipped back into fevered sleep. This pattern continued for 3 more days. Sarah would wake occasionally, confused and frightened, and Frank would coax her to drink water or broth. He barely left her side except to care for his animals and prepare food. He slept in the chair by her bed, waking at every sound she made. His world narrowed to that small room, to the battle against the fever that threatened to take her. On the 4th morning, Frank woke to find Sarah's eyes on him. This time they were clearer, more alert. "You have been caring for me all this time," she asked. Frank nodded, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. Yes, madam. Why? The question was simple, but the answer was complex. Frank searched for the right words. Because you needed help and I was there. Because letting someone die when you can do something to save them isn't right. Because... He trailed off, unable to articulate the strange connection he'd felt from the moment he'd caught her falling. Because, Sarah prompted, something curious in her gaze. Because I couldn't do anything else, Frank finished quietly. Sarah was silent for a long moment, then whispered, "Thank you." Frank felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Your fever's breaking. I think you're going to be all right." And she was. Over the next few days, Sarah's strength gradually returned. She was able to sit up then to take more substantial meals. Frank moved his bedroll to the main room, giving her privacy, though he kept the door open so he could hear if she called out. As Sarah recovered, they talked. Frank learned that she'd come from Kansas, fleeing a stepfather who tried to force her into marriage with his business partner. Teaching was one of the few respectable professions available to a woman alone, and she jumped at the opportunity in Fort Stanton, even though it meant traveling into rough territory. She spoke of her students with warmth, of her small apartment at the boarding house, of her dreams of saving enough money to perhaps one day open a school of her own. Frank found himself sharing things he rarely spoke about. His childhood on a farm in Missouri, his parents' deaths from influenza, his move west with his younger brother Daniel, how he'd worked cattle drives to save money for land, how he'd finally bought this place 3 years ago, how Daniel had left for California last year, seeking gold, and Frank hadn't heard from him since, how lonely it sometimes got, working the land alone. "Do you regret it?" Sarah asked one evening as they sat in the main room. She was wrapped in a blanket in the rocking chair, still weak but improving daily. "Staying here when your brother left," Frank considered the question. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but this is my home. I built something here. I'm not ready to give that up chasing dreams that might not pan out." "That is very wise," Sarah said softly. "I think we are alike in that way. We both value stability." Their eyes met, and Frank felt that same tightness in his chest he'd experienced when he first caught her. It was stronger now, more insistent. He was falling for her. The realization should have terrified him, but instead it felt right, as natural as breathing. On the 7th day, there was a knock at the door. Frank opened it to find Dr. Morrison, a gray-haired man with kind eyes and perpetually rumpled clothes. "Henderson told me about Miss Palmer," the doctor said without preamble. "How is she?" "Much better," Frank replied, stepping aside to let him in. "The fever broke 3 days ago." Dr. Morrison examined Sarah thoroughly, asking questions about her symptoms and recovery. Finally, he nodded with satisfaction. "You did well, Frank. Many wouldn't have survived a fever that severe without proper medical care. You must have taken excellent care of her." Sarah's eyes found Frank's across the room. "He never left my side," she said quietly. "Not once." The doctor looked between them, and Frank thought he saw understanding dawn in the older man's eyes. "Well, Miss Palmer, you'll need to take it easy for at least another week. No going back to work yet. Your body needs time to fully recover." After the doctor left, an awkward silence fell. Sarah broke it first. "I should return to the boarding house. You have done more than enough, and I have imposed on you far too long." "You haven't imposed," Frank said quickly. "And honestly, I'd feel better if you stayed a bit longer, just to make sure you're really all right." "Frank, people will talk. They probably already are. I cannot damage your reputation further by staying." "I don't care what people say," Frank said, and he meant it. "But I understand if you're uncomfortable. I'll take you back to town whenever you're ready." Sarah looked down at her hands. "It is not that I am uncomfortable. You have been nothing but a gentleman. It is just, Propriety matters, especially for a schoolteacher. Frank nodded, disappointment heavy in his gut. I understand. I'll hitch up the wagon tomorrow morning. That night, Frank couldn't sleep. He lay on his bedroll, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out how to tell Sarah what he was feeling. It seemed impossible. They'd known each other barely more than a week, most of which she'd spent unconscious or delirious. But he couldn't deny what was in his heart. The next morning, as Frank prepared the wagon, Sarah emerged from the house wearing her dress, now cleaned and mended. She looked pale but determined. Frank helped her up onto the seat, then climbed up beside her. The ride to town was quiet. Frank wanted to say something, anything, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he say? That he'd fallen in love with her while nursing her through a fever. That the thought of not seeing her every day felt like losing something precious. She'd think he was crazy. They were halfway to town when Sarah spoke. I will pay you back for everything. The food, the doctor's visit, your time. I do not have much, but I will find a way. I don't want your money, Sarah. Then what do you want? She turned to look at him, and there was something in her eyes, a question or maybe a hope. Frank pulled the wagon to a stop. They were alone on the dusty road with nothing but scrub, brush, and distant mountains around them. I want to see you again. Properly, I mean, courting. Sarah's breath caught. Frank, we hardly know each other. I know you're strong and brave. You came all the way out here alone to escape a bad situation and build a life for yourself. I know you care about your students, that you're gentle and kind. I know you talk in your sleep about making sure everyone has enough to eat, which tells me you've known hunger and never want anyone else to suffer it. I know that when you smile, really smile, it lights up your whole face. And I know that I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks. You cannot possibly love me, not yet. Maybe not love, not yet, Frank conceded, but the beginning of it. Something that could grow into love if you'd give it a chance. Give us a chance. Sarah wiped at her tears with trembling fingers. People will say you only want me because you feel responsible for me, that I am only agreeing out of obligation. Do you care what people say? I care about my job. If the school board thinks I am improper, they will dismiss me. Frank took her hand gently. Then we'll court respectably. I'll come calling at the boarding house like a proper suitor. We'll go on chaperoned walks. Whatever needs to be done to protect your reputation. I just want the chance to know you better, to see if this feeling between us is real. You feel it too, Sarah whispered. I thought perhaps it was just me, that I was confusing gratitude for something more. It's not gratitude, Frank said firmly. At least not just that. I can't explain it, Sarah. From the moment I caught you falling, something in me just knew you were important, knew I had to protect you. Knew I couldn't let you go without trying. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her hand still in his. Finally, she squeezed his fingers. One chance, but we do this properly. No more staying alone together. Everything must be respectable. Joy flooded through Frank. Anything you want. Whatever makes you comfortable. They continued to town, and Frank delivered Sarah to the boarding house. Mrs. Crawford, a stout woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, fussed over Sarah like a mother hen, shooting Frank suspicious glances. But Sarah spoke up, explaining how Frank had saved her life and cared for her with complete propriety. The doctor said Frank's nursing was excellent, Sarah added. I would have died without him. Mrs. Crawford's expression softened slightly. Well then, I suppose we owe you thanks, Mr. Emerson, but Sarah needs rest now and proper surroundings. Frank tipped his hat. Yes, madam. Miss Palmer, may I call on you in a few days once you're feeling stronger? Sarah smiled, that full, bright smile Frank had glimpsed in her recovery. I would like that very much, Mr. Emerson. Over the following weeks, Frank became a regular visitor at the boarding house. He and Sarah would sit in the parlor under Mrs. Crawford's watchful eye, talking for hours. Sometimes they'd walk through town together, always with Mrs. Crawford or another boarder as chaperone. Frank learned more about Sarah's childhood, about the mother she'd lost when she was 12, about the stepfather who'd seen her as a burden, and then as a commodity to be traded. Sarah learned about Frank's dreams of expanding his ranch, of maybe raising horses along with cattle, of building something lasting. When school resumed in September, Frank would wait outside the schoolhouse sometimes, just to catch a glimpse of Sarah with her students. He saw how patient she was, how she made learning fun, how even the roughest boys responded to her gentle firmness. It made him love her more, because it was love now, Frank was certain. He loved the way she wrinkled her nose when she was thinking hard. He loved how she always noticed when someone needed help and found ways to provide it without making them feel pitied. He loved her quiet strength and her soft heart. He loved everything about her. One evening in October, as they sat on the boarding house porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, Frank took Sarah's hand. Mrs. Crawford sat in her chair behind them knitting, but she'd grown more relaxed about chaperoning as Frank had proven himself consistently respectful. "Sarah, I need to tell you something," Frank said, his heart pounding. Sarah turned to him, her brown eyes warm. "What is it? I love you. I know we said we'd take this slow, and we have, but I can't keep it inside anymore. I love you and I want to marry you. I want to build a life with you. I want to come home every day to you. I want to give you the family and home you deserve. I know I'm not rich and my ranch is small, but I work hard and I'll spend every day trying to make you happy. Will you marry me, Sarah?" Tears sparkled in Sarah's eyes, but she was smiling. "Oh, Frank, I love you too. I have for weeks now." I tried to be sensible, to not rush, but my heart would not listen. "Yes, I will marry you. Absolutely yes." Frank wanted to pull her into his arms and kiss her right there, but with Mrs. Crawford watching and propriety to maintain, he settled for lifting Sarah's hand to his lips and kissing it gently. "You've made me the happiest man alive." Mrs. Crawford cleared her throat loudly. "Well, I suppose congratulations are in order. When's the wedding?" Frank and Sarah looked at each other and laughed. They hadn't gotten that far yet. The wedding was planned for November, giving them time to make proper arrangements but not waiting so long that people would talk. Sarah spent her evenings sewing a new dress, a beautiful blue cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs. Frank fixed up the house, adding touches he thought Sarah would appreciate: curtains for the windows, a new shelf for books, a proper stove to replace his old one. The night before the wedding, Frank barely slept. Not from nerves, but from excitement. Tomorrow, Sarah would be his wife. Tomorrow, his life would truly begin. The ceremony took place in the small church in Fort Stanton. Most of the town turned out, curious about the schoolteacher who was marrying the quiet rancher who'd saved her life. The preacher, Reverend Williams, kept the service simple but meaningful. When Frank saw Sarah walking down the aisle, his breath caught. She looked beautiful, radiant with happiness. Her eyes were only for him, and Frank knew his were only for her. "Do you, Frank Emerson, take Sarah Palmer to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do," Frank said firmly, his voice clear. "And do you, Sarah Palmer, take Frank Emerson to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do," Sarah said, her voice soft but sure. "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Frank, you may kiss your bride." Frank cupped Sarah's face gently and kissed her. It was their first real kiss, and it was perfect, tender and sweet and full of promise. The reception was held at the boarding house, with Mrs. Crawford and several other ladies providing food and drink. There was no fancy wedding cake, no elaborate decorations, but there was joy and laughter and well wishes from friends and neighbors. Frank danced with his bride, holding her close, marveling that this incredible woman was now his wife. As evening fell, Frank and Sarah rode back to the ranch together. Their ranch now, Frank corrected himself. Everything he had was now hers too. Inside the house, Sarah looked around with new eyes. "This is really our home," she said wonderingly. "Our home," Frank confirmed. He pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. "Sarah Emerson, I promise to spend every day of my life making you happy." "You already make me happy," Sarah whispered. "Just by being you, just by loving me." They kissed again, longer this time, with more passion. Sarah's hands tangled in Frank's hair and Frank's arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her closer. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. "I love you, Frank Emerson," Sarah said. "I love you, Sarah Emerson," Frank replied. That night was their wedding night, and Frank was gentle and patient with Sarah, who came to their bed nervous but trusting. He made sure her first time was filled with tenderness and love, taking his time, putting her comfort and pleasure above his own needs. Afterward, they lay tangled together, Sarah's head on Frank's chest, listening to his heartbeat. "Are you all right?" Frank asked softly, stroking her hair. "More than all right," Sarah murmured. "I am happy, truly, completely happy." Frank kissed the top of her head. "Me too." The first months of marriage were an adjustment. Sarah had to resign from her teaching position, as married women were not allowed to teach. She was sad to leave her students, but excited to build her new life with Frank. She threw herself into making the house a home, adding her touches everywhere. She planted a vegetable garden, made proper curtains, organized Frank's chaotic collection of tools and supplies. Frank, for his part, worked harder than ever to provide for his wife. He expanded his herd, took on extra work when he could, and started seriously planning the horse breeding operation he'd always dreamed of. Every evening, no matter how tired he was, he'd come home to Sarah, and the weariness would fall away when he saw her smile. They learned each other's rhythms and habits. Sarah discovered that Frank was an early riser who liked his coffee strong and black. Frank learned that Sarah hummed while she cooked and always read for an hour before bed. They learned how to compromise, how to communicate, how to be partners in every sense of the word. In February, Sarah started feeling sick in the mornings. At first, she thought she'd caught another fever and panic seized her, remembering how close she'd come to death before. But Mrs. Crawford, visiting one afternoon, took one look at Sarah's pale face and knowing smile. "You are not sick, dear," the older woman said kindly. "You are with child." Sarah's hand flew to her stomach. A baby. She was going to have Frank's baby. Joy and fear mingled inside her. She'd heard stories of women dying in childbirth, of babies who didn't survive. But she'd also heard stories of healthy births, of the incredible love a parent felt for their child. When Frank came home that evening, Sarah met him at the door, unable to contain her news. "Frank, I am pregnant. We are going to have a baby." Frank's eyes went wide, then a huge grin spread across his face. He picked Sarah up and spun her around, laughing. "A baby! We're going to have a baby." Then he set her down carefully, as if she might break. "Are you all right? Should you be standing? Do you need to sit down? Should I get the doctor?" Sarah laughed at his sudden nervousness. "I am fine. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I am healthy and strong, especially thanks to you nursing me back to health all those months ago." But Frank insisted on being extra careful with Sarah from that day forward. He barely let her lift anything heavy, worried constantly about her health, and drove Sarah to affectionate exasperation with his hovering. But she couldn't really complain. It was sweet how much he cared. As Sarah's belly grew through spring and into summer, Frank prepared for the baby's arrival. He built a cradle from smooth pine wood, sanding it carefully so there were no rough edges. He traded work with a neighbor for a supply of soft cotton fabric, which Sarah sewed into baby clothes and blankets. They turned a corner of their bedroom into a nursery space, and Frank painted the walls a cheerful yellow. On a hot August evening, exactly 1 year after Sarah had fainted in the general store, she went into labor. Frank sent for Mrs. Crawford, who had experience with birthing, and for Dr. Morrison. Then he paced the main room, listening to Sarah's cries and feeling helpless. Mrs. Crawford emerged hours later, exhausted but smiling. "You have a healthy son, Frank, and Sarah did wonderfully. She's tired but fine." Frank rushed into the bedroom to find Sarah propped up against pillows, looking exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in one of her handmade blankets. She looked up at Frank with tears in her eyes. "Meet your son," she said softly. Frank approached slowly, almost afraid to breathe. He looked down at the tiny red face, the shock of dark hair, the impossibly small fingers curled into fists. His son. His and Sarah's son. "He's perfect," Frank whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You're both perfect. Would you like to hold him?" Sarah asked. Frank nodded, unable to speak. Sarah carefully transferred the baby into his arms, showing him how to support the head. Frank looked down at his son and felt his entire world shift. This tiny person, this precious life, was now his responsibility. His to protect, to provide for, to raise into a good man. "What should we name him?" Sarah asked. They discussed names before but never settled on one. Now, holding his son, Frank thought of the past year, of how he'd almost lost Sarah before he ever really knew her, of how he'd nursed her back to health and fallen in love in the process, of how blessed he was. "Thomas," Frank said. "Thomas James Emerson, Tom for short." "Thomas," Sarah repeated, testing the name. "I like it. Hello, Thomas. Welcome to the world." Baby Thomas grew quickly, thriving under the devoted care of his parents. Frank proved to be an adoring father, spending every spare moment with his son. He'd work all day on the ranch, then come home and help Sarah with the baby, changing diapers without complaint, walking Tom around when he was fussy, singing off key lullabies that somehow always soothed the boy. Sarah bloomed as a mother. Despite her fears during pregnancy, she took to motherhood naturally. She was patient and loving, nursing Tom and caring for him with the same gentle determination she'd shown as a teacher. Often, Frank would find her in the rocking chair, Tom at her breast, humming softly, and his heart would swell with love for his little family. The following year brought new challenges. A harsh winter killed several head of cattle, putting a strain on their finances. But Frank and Sarah worked through it together. Sarah started taking in sewing work, her neat stitches and eye for detail making her popular with the town ladies. Frank took on extra jobs, helping neighbors with building projects and breaking horses. They economized where they could, but they never went without necessities, and their love never wavered. In the spring of 1881, Sarah became pregnant again. Tom was now a sturdy 2-year-old, toddling around the ranch and getting into everything with the fearless curiosity of a child. Sarah worried about managing 2 young children, but Frank reassured her. "We'll figure it out together," he said, holding her close. "Just like we've figured out everything else. This pregnancy was easier than the first." Sarah knew what to expect, and her body seemed to handle it better. In November, she gave birth to a daughter. They named her Margaret Rose, calling her Maggie. Maggie was different from Tom in every way. Where Tom had been a relatively calm baby, Maggie was spirited and demanding. She nursed constantly, cried when put down, and only seemed content when being held. Frank and Sarah took turns walking her at night, both exhausted but devoted. Tom adjusted to having a sister with the adaptability of the very young. He was curious about the baby, wanting to touch her soft hair and hold her tiny hands. Frank and Sarah supervised carefully, teaching Tom to be gentle, and their son proved to be surprisingly tender with his baby sister. As the children grew, so did the ranch. Frank's horse breeding operation finally took off. He had a good eye for horses and a patient hand in training them. Word spread about the quality of Emerson horses, and buyers came from as far as Santa Fe. The financial pressure that had weighed on them eased, and Frank was able to expand the house, adding a proper room for each child and a larger kitchen for Sarah. Life settled into a rhythm. Frank worked the ranch with help from hired hands when needed. Sarah managed the household, raised the children, and kept her sewing business going. Tom and Maggie grew strong and healthy, full of energy and laughter. The house was often chaotic, with children playing, chores to be done, and the constant work of running a ranch, but it was a happy chaos. One evening in the summer of 1884, Frank and Sarah sat on their porch watching the sunset. Tom, now 5, was playing with wooden horses Frank had carved for him. Maggie, 3, was picking wildflowers in the yard under their watchful eyes. Sarah leaned against Frank's shoulder, content. "You ever think about that day in the general store?" Sarah asked. "When this all started?" Frank wrapped his arm around her. "Sometimes. I think about how close I came to never knowing you. If I'd walked in 5 minutes later, if someone else had caught you, if things had gone differently in 100 small ways." "I think about it too," Sarah said softly. "I was so scared when I woke up in a strange place with a man I did not know. But you were so kind, so patient. You saved my life, Frank." "You saved mine too," Frank said. "I didn't know it at the time, but I was lonely. I had the ranch, but nothing that really mattered. No real purpose beyond survival. You and the children, you gave me a reason for everything. You made my life complete." Sarah turned to look at him, love shining in her eyes. "I fell in love with you while you were caring for me, you know. Even through the fever, I was aware of you sometimes. Your voice, your touch, the way you never gave up. When I finally woke up fully and saw you sitting there, exhausted from days of nursing me, I thought you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen." Frank laughed. "Beautiful? I was probably a mess. I hadn't shaved or slept properly in days." "You were beautiful to me," Sarah insisted, "because I could see your heart, and it was good and true." Frank kissed her softly. "I love you, Sarah Emerson, more than I ever thought it was possible to love someone." "I love you too, Frank Emerson. Forever." Tom came running up to the porch then. "Papa, look. I made the horses jump over the fence." He demonstrated with his wooden toys, and Frank praised his son's imagination. Maggie toddled over with a fistful of crushed flowers, presenting them to Sarah with a proud smile. Sarah accepted them as if they were the finest roses, kissing Maggie's forehead. This was their life. Not glamorous or easy, but filled with love and purpose. Frank looked at his family, his home, everything they'd built together, and felt a profound gratitude. 5 years ago, he'd been a lonely rancher with no real direction. Now he was a husband, a father, a man with a family he'd give his life to protect. The years continued to pass, bringing both joy and challenges. In 1886, when Tom was 7 and Maggie 5, a drought hit the region hard. Many ranchers lost everything, but Frank's careful management and diversification into horses paid off. They struggled but survived, even managing to help some neighbors who were worse off. Tom proved to be a bright boy with his father's steady temperament, and his mother's kind heart. He loved the horses and begged Frank to teach him everything about breeding and training them. Frank was patient, showing his son the ropes, proud of Tom's natural aptitude with animals. Maggie was more like her mother, interested in books and learning. Sarah taught both children to read and write, creating a small school room in their home. Maggie soaked up knowledge like a sponge, always asking questions, always wanting to know more. Sarah would tell Frank stories about their daughter's curiosity, and they'd both laugh, seeing so much of Sarah in the little girl. In 1888, Sarah became pregnant once more. She was 32 now, and this pregnancy was harder than the previous ones. She was often tired and sick, and Frank worried constantly. Dr. Morrison checked on her regularly, assuring Frank that some pregnancies were simply more difficult than others. In March of 1889, Sarah gave birth to twin boys. The labor was long and difficult, and Frank spent hours pacing outside the bedroom door, terrified he might lose his wife. When Mrs. Crawford finally emerged to tell him Sarah and the babies were all fine, he nearly collapsed with relief. Sarah was exhausted but smiling when Frank entered the room. She held one baby while Mrs. Crawford held the other. "Meet your sons," Sarah said. "We need 2 more names now." Frank looked at his identical twin sons, both with wisps of blonde hair and scrunched-up faces, and felt the same overwhelming love he'd felt when Tom and Maggie were born. "How about Daniel after my brother and Samuel after your father?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Her father had died when she was young, but she remembered him fondly. Daniel and Samuel, Danny and Sam, perfect. Raising twins proved to be even more challenging than raising 2 children of different ages. Danny and Sam seemed to operate as a unit, doing everything together. If one cried, the other joined in. If one was hungry, the other was too. Frank and Sarah were constantly exhausted those first few months, taking turns with night feedings and diaper changes. Tom and Maggie helped as much as they could. At 9 and 7, they were old enough to be useful. Tom would fetch things for his mother, and Maggie loved to sit beside Sarah while she nursed the twins, singing to them in her sweet voice. The family pulled together, supporting each other through the chaos. As the twins grew into toddlers, their distinct personalities emerged. Danny was bold and adventurous, always getting into things he shouldn't. Sam was quieter, more thoughtful, content to observe before acting. They were inseparable, though, and watching them interact was a constant source of amusement for the family. The ranch continued to prosper. Frank now employed 3 full-time ranch hands, and the Emerson name was well respected throughout the territory. They'd come a long way from the struggling young rancher and the sick schoolteacher who'd started with nothing but love and determination. In 1892, New Mexico was moving toward statehood, bringing changes to the territory. Fort Stanton was growing, with more businesses opening and more families settling in the area. Tom, now 13, was helping Frank run the ranch, showing a real talent for the work. Maggie, 11, was teaching the twins their letters, having inherited her mother's patience and love of education. One summer evening, the whole family gathered on the porch after dinner. The twins, now 3, were playing at Frank and Sarah's feet. Tom was repairing a bridle, working with the confident movements of someone who knew what he was doing. Maggie was reading aloud from a book, her voice clear and expressive. Frank looked at Sarah, who was watching their children with a soft smile. Her hair had some gray in it now, and there were lines around her eyes from years of laughter and sun. She was even more beautiful to him than she'd been as a young woman. Time and life had only deepened his love for her. As if feeling his gaze, Sarah turned to him. Her smile widened and she reached for his hand. Frank took it, lacing their fingers together, marveling as he always did at how perfectly they fit. "What are you thinking about?" Sarah asked quietly. "How lucky I am," Frank replied. "How incredibly blessed. I have a wonderful wife, 4 amazing children, a successful ranch, good health. I couldn't ask for more." "We have built a good life," Sarah agreed. "Sometimes I still cannot believe it all started because I fainted in a general store." "Best thing that ever happened to me," Frank said. "Well, second best. The best thing was you agreeing to marry me," Sarah laughed. "Flatterer, truth-teller," Frank corrected. The twins suddenly started squabbling over a toy, their voices rising. Maggie looked up from her book with a sigh. "Boys share, you have other toys." "No, I had it first," Danny protested. "Sam grabbed it from me." This from Sam, the irony of his statement lost on him. Tom looked up from his work, grinning. "Remember when we thought 2 children was hard?" Frank and Sarah laughed. "Every child makes you wonder how you managed before," Sarah said. "And yet I would not change a thing. Well, perhaps a bit more sleep." "Sleep is overrated," Frank joked, then stood to separate the squabbling twins. He picked up each boy, one in each arm, and spun them around until they were giggling instead of fighting. Crisis averted, at least for the moment. The years continued their steady march. Tom grew into a fine young man, taking on more and more responsibility at the ranch. At 16, he could handle almost anything Frank could, and Frank relied on him heavily. They worked together as partners, and Frank knew that someday the ranch would pass to Tom, and it would be in good hands. Maggie developed into a lovely young woman with her mother's grace and intelligence. She talked about becoming a teacher like Sarah had been, wanting to educate children in the growing territory. Sarah encouraged her, helping her study and preparing her for the qualifying exams. The twins were 10 now, still inseparable but finding their own paths. Danny wanted to be like Tom, working the ranch and handling horses. Sam had a fascination with how things worked, taking apart anything he could get his hands on and usually managing to put it back together. Frank thought he might make a fine engineer or inventor someday. In 1896, Frank and Sarah celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary. The children planned a surprise party, inviting friends and neighbors. The house was filled with people, laughter, and love. Someone brought a fiddle, and there was dancing in the yard. At one point, Frank and Sarah found themselves alone for a moment, having escaped to the porch while the party continued inside. Frank pulled Sarah into his arms, swaying to the distant music. 20 years, he murmured. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like we've been together forever. Both, Sarah said, resting her head on his shoulder. It feels like both. I cannot imagine my life without you, Frank. I do not want to. You'll never have to, Frank promised. I plan to be by your side for another 50 years at least, Sarah laughed. That would make us both very old. Then we will be very old together, Frank said. Growing old with you sounds like the best thing in the world. They danced together under the stars, the sounds of their children and friends celebrating inside, and Frank felt a peace so profound it was almost overwhelming. This was everything he'd ever wanted, everything he'd never dared to dream could be his. And it had all started with one moment, one decision to catch a falling woman and refuse to leave her side. The turn of the century brought new changes. Tom, now 21, married a sweet girl named Emily from a neighboring ranch. They built a house on Emerson land, close enough to help with the ranch but far enough to have their own space. Frank welcomed Emily into the family warmly, grateful that his son had found love. Maggie, 19, passed her teaching exams with flying colors and took a position at the school in Fort Stanton, the same school where Sarah had once taught. Sarah was incredibly proud, seeing her daughter follow in her footsteps. Maggie still lived at home, riding into town each day to teach. The twins, now 14, were both strong and capable. Danny worked alongside Tom and Frank on the ranch, while Sam spent more and more time tinkering with machinery. When the first automobiles started appearing in New Mexico, Sam was fascinated, determined to understand how they worked. Frank was now 48, his hair gray at the temples, his body bearing the marks of decades of hard work. But he was still strong, still healthy, still deeply in love with his wife. Sarah was 44, and Frank thought she was as beautiful as ever. They'd weathered everything together: illness, financial hardship, the challenges of raising 4 children, the constant work of the ranch. And their love had only grown stronger. One evening, after the children had all gone to their various homes or rooms, Frank and Sarah sat by the fire. It was winter and snow was falling softly outside. Sarah was mending one of Sam's shirts and Frank was reading the newspaper, but mostly they were just enjoying each other's presence. "Frank," Sarah said suddenly. "Yes, love. Do you remember what you said to me the day you proposed?" "About coming home to me every day," Frank set down the newspaper. "I said I wanted to come home to you every day for the rest of my life." "You have kept that promise," Sarah said softly. "Every single day, no matter how hard the work or how tired you are, you come home to me. You have given me everything you promised and more." Frank moved to sit beside her, taking the mending from her hands and setting it aside. He cupped her face gently. "Sarah, you are my home. The house, the ranch, none of it means anything without you. You are the center of my world, the reason for everything I do." Sarah's eyes glistened with tears. "I love you so much, Frank Emerson. More today than yesterday, less than tomorrow." Frank kissed her, a long, tender kiss that held 22 years of love and devotion. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. "Come to bed," Sarah whispered. "I want to fall asleep in your arms." "Always," Frank said. The years slipped by with increasing speed. Tom and Emily welcomed their first child in 1902, making Frank and Sarah grandparents. Holding his grandson for the first time, Frank was transported back to when Tom was born, remembering the overwhelming love and fear he'd felt. Now, watching his son experience that same moment, Frank felt a sense of completion. Maggie met a young lawyer named William Preston who'd opened a practice in Fort Stanton. They courted for a year before he proposed, and Maggie's wedding in 1903 was a beautiful affair. Sarah cried happy tears as she watched her daughter marry a good man who clearly adored her. The twins, now 20, were carving out their own paths. Danny had become Frank's right-hand man on the ranch, and talk was already starting about the ranch becoming Emerson and Sons. Sam had gone to Albuquerque to study engineering, writing long letters home about his courses and his excitement about the modern world. In 1905, Frank and Sarah found themselves empty nesters for the first time since Tom was born. All the children were grown and gone, pursuing their own lives. The house felt too quiet, too empty. "I miss the noise," Sarah admitted one morning over breakfast. "The chaos, the constant demands. I miss having children underfoot." "Me too," Frank said. "But we did our job. We raised them to be independent, capable adults." "They do not need us the way they used to. But we need them," Sarah said with a rueful smile. "Or perhaps I just miss being needed." "I need you," Frank said firmly. "Every day, every moment. And they need you too, just in different ways now. Maggie comes to you for advice. Tom talks to you about Emily and the baby. Even Sam writes you long letters asking your opinion on things." Sarah nodded, knowing Frank was right. But it was an adjustment, this new phase of life. She and Frank were 50 and 54 respectively, entering their later years with good health and financial security. but also with the reality that their active parenting days were behind them. They adapted, as they always had. Sarah became more involved in town activities, helping establish a library and a women's aid society. Frank continued running the ranch with Tom and Danny's help, though he was increasingly content to let the younger generation take on more of the physical work. Their house became the center for family gatherings. Every Sunday, the children would come for dinner, bringing spouses and grandchildren. The house would fill with laughter and conversation, and Frank and Sarah would sit at the head of the table, surveying their family with deep satisfaction. In 1910, Sarah took ill. It started as a cough, nothing serious, but it lingered. Dr. Morrison, now elderly himself but still practicing, examined her and diagnosed pneumonia. Frank felt a fear he hadn't experienced since Sarah's fever 32 years ago. "Not again," he told the doctor. "I cannot lose her." "She is strong, Frank," Dr. Morrison said, "and we know more now about treating these things. Keep her warm, make sure she drinks plenty of fluids, and let her rest. She should recover." Frank never left Sarah's side. Tom and Maggie came to help, but Frank was the primary nurse, just as he'd been all those years ago. He bathed Sarah's fevered face, coaxed her to drink water and broth, sat beside her through the long nights. The parallels to their first days together were not lost on either of them. "You have practice at this," Sarah joked weakly during a moment of clarity. "Too much practice," Frank replied. "I would be happy never to see you sick again." "We are getting old, my love," Sarah said. "Illness is part of that." "I do not care how old we get as long as we get there together," Frank said fiercely. Sarah squeezed his hand. "Together. Always together." Sarah recovered, though it took several weeks. Frank was attentive through all of it, and once she was well, he remained protective, insisting she not overdo things. Sarah tolerated his hovering with amusement and affection, recognizing it for what it was: love. In 1912, Maggie gave birth to her third child, and Sam returned from Albuquerque with a bride he'd met at university. The family continued to grow and expand. Frank and Sarah now had 7 grandchildren, with more likely on the way. The ranch was prospering under Tom and Danny's management. Sam had started a business in Albuquerque working with electrical systems, a field that fascinated him. One evening in the fall of 1913, Frank and Sarah took a walk around their property. They'd done this countless times over the years, but tonight felt different, special somehow. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant colors. The air was cool and crisp, smelling of autumn. They walked hand in hand to the small hill that overlooked the ranch. From here, they could see the main house, Tom's house, the barn and corrals, the pastures with horses grazing peacefully. 35 years of hard work and love spread out before them. "We built something good here," Frank said, "something that will last beyond us." "We did," Sarah agreed. "A legacy for our children and grandchildren. But more than that, we built a life together, a true partnership. That is what I am most proud of." Frank turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. Even after 35 years of marriage, she still made his heart race. Her hair was silver now, her face lined with age, but her eyes were the same warm brown that had captivated him when she first woke in his spare bedroom all those years ago. "Sarah Emerson, I have loved you since the moment I caught you falling in that general store. Every day since then I have loved you more. You are my greatest adventure, my truest friend, my partner in everything. Thank you for saying yes all those years ago. Thank you for building this life with me. Thank you for being you." Tears streamed down Sarah's face. "Frank Emerson, you saved my life. Not just from the fever, but from a future of loneliness and fear. You gave me a home, a family, a purpose. You gave me love beyond anything I ever dreamed possible. Every day I wake up grateful that I walked into that general store on that August day in 1878. Grateful that you were there to catch me. Grateful for every moment we have shared since then." They stood together on the hill, holding each other as the sun set and the first stars appeared. This was their life, their love story. It had started with an act of kindness and grown into something beautiful and lasting. The years continued as years do. Frank and Sarah grew older but never grew apart. They faced the challenges of aging together, aching joints, fading eyesight, the loss of friends and contemporaries. But they also enjoyed the gifts of old age, wisdom, perspective, the deep satisfaction of a life well lived. Their children remained close, visiting often, bringing grandchildren and eventually great-grandchildren. The ranch passed to Tom and Danny, who ran it with the same dedication Frank had shown. Maggie's children grew up to become teachers and lawyers, carrying on the family tradition of service. Sam's engineering business flourished, and he credited his success to the problem-solving skills he'd learned growing up on the ranch. In 1925, Frank and Sarah celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. It was a grand affair, with the entire extended family gathering at the ranch. There were now 16 grandchildren and 5 great-grandchildren. The house couldn't hold everyone, so tables were set up outside, and a celebration that rivaled the town's 4th of July festivities took place. Frank and Sarah, now 73 and 69 respectively, sat in chairs of honor, greeting guests and accepting well wishes. At one point, Tom stood to make a speech. "I have been blessed with the best example of love and marriage anyone could ask for," Tom said, his voice thick with emotion. "My parents have shown us all what commitment means, what partnership looks like, what true love can accomplish. They have built not just a successful ranch, but a family bound together by love and respect. Everything I am, everything we all are, we owe to them." To Frank and Sarah Emerson, the strongest, most loving couple I have ever known. Everyone raised their glasses, echoing Tom's toast. Frank and Sarah looked at each other, tears in both their eyes. This was their legacy. Not just the land or the business, but the love they'd created and nurtured, the family they'd raised. As the celebration continued around them, Frank leaned close to Sarah. "Any regrets?" Sarah shook her head. "Not a single one." "Well, perhaps I wish I could go back and tell that frightened young woman waking up in a stranger's house that everything was going to be more than all right. That the man caring for her would become her whole world. And I wish I could tell that young cowboy who caught a falling woman that she was going to be his salvation," Frank replied. "That loving her would be the best thing he ever did." They kissed, much to the delight of their grandchildren, who cheered and whistled. Frank and Sarah laughed, surrounded by their family, their legacy, their love made manifest. The final years of their lives were peaceful. Frank's health began to fail in 1928, his heart growing weak. Dr. Morrison's son, who'd taken over his father's practice, told Sarah gently that Frank likely only had months left. Sarah refused to accept this, caring for Frank with the same devotion he'd once shown her. But Frank was ready. He was 82 years old, had lived a full and satisfying life, and was tired. What bothered him was the thought of leaving Sarah alone. "Promise me you will be all right," he said one evening as they lay in bed together. Sarah was curled against his side, her head on his shoulder, just as she'd done for 50 years. "I will be with our children," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "And our grandchildren. I will be surrounded by the family we created, but Frank, I cannot promise I will be all right without you." "You are my heart." "And you are mine," Frank whispered. "But Sarah, we have had 50 incredible years. more than most people ever dream of. We have loved deeply and been loved in return. We have raised 4 wonderful children and seen them thrive. We have built something lasting. If I have to leave you, and it seems I must, I leave knowing our love will continue through our family." Sarah was crying openly now. "I am not ready to lose you. I am not ready to leave you," Frank said. "But I am also not afraid. How can I be when I have lived such a blessed life? When I have loved and been loved by the most amazing woman in the world?" They held each other through the night, and in the morning, surrounded by their children, Frank Emerson passed peacefully from this world. Sarah was devastated by Frank's death, as anyone would be after losing their partner of 50 years. But she found comfort in her family and in the memories of their life together. She lived with Tom and Emily for a while, then with Maggie and William. She never remarried, telling anyone who suggested it that she'd had her great love and nothing could compare. Sarah lived another 5 years, dying peacefully in her sleep in 1933 at the age of 77. Her last words, according to Maggie, who was with her, were, "I am coming, Frank. Wait for me." They buried Sarah next to Frank on the hill overlooking the ranch. At her funeral, their children and grandchildren shared stories of Frank and Sarah's love, of the life they'd built, of the legacy they'd left. It was a celebration as much as a mourning, honoring 2 lives well lived and a love that had lasted beyond death. Tom took over the main house with Emily, and the ranch continued to prosper. The Emerson name remained respected throughout New Mexico. Frank and Sarah's grandchildren told their own children about the cowboy who'd caught a falling woman and never left her side, about the love that had grown from that moment into something extraordinary. The house still stands today, over a century after Frank first carried Sarah through its doors. It has been modernized over the years, but the core remains the same. The bedroom where Frank nursed Sarah back to health is preserved as it was, a shrine to where their love story began. The rocking chair where Sarah nursed their babies sits in a place of honor. The cradle Frank built for Tom has been passed down through generations, cradling each new Emerson baby on the hill where Frank and Sarah are buried. Their headstones sit side by side. Frank's reads, "Frank Emerson, beloved husband, father, and friend. He lived with honor and loved with all his heart." Sarah's reads, "Sarah Emerson, beloved wife, mother, and friend. She was loved and she loved in return." Between the headstones, carved into a single stone, are the words, "Together in life, together in death, together in love forever." And that is the story of Frank and Sarah Emerson, the cowboy and the schoolteacher whose love began with a fever and a stranger's kindness and lasted beyond a lifetime. It is a story of devotion, of partnership, of commitment through good times and bad. It is a story that has been told and retold through 5 generations of Emersons, a reminder that true love exists and that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected moments. On August afternoons, when the heat shimmers over the New Mexico landscape, some say you can still feel the love Frank and Sarah shared. In the general store in Fort Stanton, which has been renovated but never torn down, locals will point to the spot where Sarah fainted and Frank caught her. They tell the story to tourists and newcomers, keeping the legend alive. The Emerson Ranch, now run by Frank and Sarah's great-great-grandchildren, remains a working ranch. Horses still graze in the pastures. The house is still filled with family on Sundays. And on the anniversary of Frank and Sarah's wedding every November, the entire extended Emerson family gathers to honor the couple who started it all. They raise glasses to Frank and Sarah, to the love that began in crisis and grew through devotion. They tell stories passed down through the years, each generation adding their own memories and observations. and they are reminded that love, real and true and lasting, is possible. That commitment means staying by someone's side through sickness and health, through poverty and prosperity, through every challenge life brings. Frank and Sarah's great-granddaughter, named Sarah after her ancestor, keeps a journal that Frank wrote in during his later years. In it, he reflected on his life and his love for his wife. She often reads from it at the anniversary gatherings, and one passage in particular always brings tears. "I was just a lonely cowboy with a small ranch and no real direction until the day Sarah Palmer fainted in that general store. In that moment, my life gained purpose. In catching her, I caught my future. In nursing her back to health, I discovered my capacity for love. In marrying her, I became complete. Every day of our 50 years together has been a gift. Every moment with her has been precious. If I could go back and change anything, I would not, because every step led me to her, and she is everything. She is my home, my heart, my life. Future generations of Emersons know this. The love Sarah and I shared was built on respect, honesty, devotion, and choice. Every day we chose each other. Every day we worked to make our partnership stronger. Love is not just a feeling. It is a commitment, an action, a daily decision. Choose love. Choose partnership. Choose to never leave the side of the one who holds your heart. That is how you build something lasting. These words, written by a cowboy over a century ago, still resonate today. They remind the Emerson family and anyone who hears their story that true love is possible. That it starts with a moment, a choice, a decision to care for another person. And that it grows through the years, through challenges and joys alike, into something beautiful and lasting. The story of Frank and Sarah Emerson is more than just a love story. It is a testament to the power of human connection, to the strength that comes from partnership, to the beauty that can arise from choosing to care for another person. It began with a woman fainting from fever and a cowboy who caught her and never left her side. It grew into a love that spanned 50 years and created a legacy that continues today. In the end, what more could anyone ask for? A love that lasts, a partnership that strengthens, a family that endures. These are the things Frank and Sarah built together, starting from nothing but a stranger's kindness and a choice to give love a chance. Their story reminds us all that sometimes the most extraordinary things come from the most ordinary moments. A woman shopping at a general store. A man walking through a door at just the right moment. A fever that brought two souls together. And a love that lasted beyond a lifetime. This is the legacy of Frank and Sarah Emerson. This is the power of love that begins with staying by someone's side and never leaving, through illness and health, through all the days of a life well lived together.